Father Anselm Virot's hands did not shake as he lifted the host into the light. Below him, 15 German commanders knelt in formation, waiting to receive communion. None of them knew they had less than an hour to live. None of them suspected that the most sacred moment of the Mass would become their execution. And none of them understood that the quiet priest they had dismissed for 3 years had been preparing for this single moment since the day they first walked through his cathedral doors. This is the story of how faith became a weapon, and how one man used the Eucharist to change the course of a war. On a gray December morning in 1943, inside a cathedral that had survived 3 years of occupation, not by miracle but by permission, Father Anselm Virot raised the consecrated host above his head. Sunlight pierced the stained glass behind him, casting crimson and gold across the stone floor. The scent of incense hung thick in the cold air. Below him, 15 German commanders knelt in perfect formation, hands clasped, medals gleaming against black uniforms. His voice echoed through the vaulted ceiling as he spoke the ancient words of the Eucharist. But concealed in the sacristy behind him, prepared in absolute silence an hour before dawn, was a chalice containing something the Germans would never suspect. In less than 30 minutes he would complete one of the most devastating acts of resistance in occupied France, and by nightfall he would cease to exist in any official record. This is the story that was buried with the men who died that day. You need to understand something right now. This wasn't a partisan fighter. This wasn't a saboteur. This was a man who had spent 22 years serving God in quiet devotion. He had taken holy vows. He had baptized children, married couples, buried the innocent. He had never fired a weapon. He had never thrown a punch. He had never even refused an order from the occupiers. But on that December morning, Father Anselm Virot made a decision that would save villages he would never see and condemn his soul to a question that has no answer. The question isn't whether he did it. The documents, the ones that survived, confirm 15 commanders collapsed within the cathedral walls before sunset. The question is how a man of God convinced himself that consecrating poison was an act of faith. And by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly why he believed there was no other path. Let's rewind 3 years. It's September 1940, and the world Father Virot knew has already been shattered. France, defeated in 6 weeks, is now carved into zones of occupation and collaboration. The cathedral where Father Virot has served since 1921, the Cathedral of Saint-Michel in the town of Aumont, has stood for over 400 years. It was a place of refuge, of marriage vows and funeral masses, of Easter celebrations and midnight prayers. Father Virot himself was known for his homilies, for his patience with frightened children, and for the way he could make even the dying feel at peace. But when the Wehrmacht entered Aumont in June 1940, everything shifted. The Germans didn't destroy the cathedral. They claimed it. Unlike the churches in neighboring towns that were looted or converted into storage facilities, this cathedral remained operational, but only because it served a purpose. It offered legitimacy. It provided a stage for the illusion of normalcy. The sight of uniformed officers attending Mass sent a message. Even God had been subdued. Father Virot was allowed to remain, but not because he was trusted. He was useful. His restraint was mistaken for submission. His silence was interpreted as obedience. And so he stayed, performing Mass under the watchful eyes of men who wore their crimes like decorations. For 3 years, Father Virot lived in this calculated hell. He buried children killed as warnings to the town. He heard confessions from German officers who spoke not of sins but of operations, villages to be cleared, deportations scheduled, quotas to be met. The confessional became a ledger of future atrocities. He watched as sacred ritual was hollowed into performance art, each mass a propaganda image for the occupiers. And every single night, he prayed for deliverance. But deliverance never came. So in December 1943, when the commanders announced a ceremonial mass before launching their pacification sweep of the surrounding region, a sweep that would leave hundreds dead, Father Anselm Virot made a choice. He would become the deliverance he had prayed for. So here's the question I want you to answer right now. Do you side with the 15 commanders who knelt in that cathedral, men who attended Mass not for forgiveness, but for optics, who turned sacred ritual into a propaganda tool while planning their next massacre? Or do you side with Father Virot, a man who chose damnation over complicity, who used the holiest act in Christianity to stop an atrocity no one else could prevent? If you're on Father Virot's side, if you believe what he did was an act of mercy and not murder, then prove it. Hit that subscribe button, like this video, because every subscription tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Every like pushes back against 80 years of silence. And every share is a vote that says, we will not let the men who weaponized faith also control who gets remembered. This is how we honor resistance. This is how we fight erasure. Subscribe now. Okay, now you've done that. Back into the story. By December 1943, Father Virot would become the instrument of deliverance. But in September 1940, he was simply trying to survive the arrival of an occupying force that understood symbolism better than most armies ever had. The Wehrmacht entered Aumont without firing a shot. There were no dramatic battles, no last stands in the town square. The soldiers arrived in tight formation, positioned sentries at key intersections, and began the methodical work of occupation. Executions happened, but not here. They occurred in the woods outside town, in the quarry near the river, in places visible enough to send a message but distant enough to maintain the illusion of order within Aumont itself. Across the region, churches met predictable fates. In the village of Saint-Rémy, 12 kilometers east, the chapel was stripped of its bronze bells and converted into a grain storage facility. In Morlaix, the 16th century Church of the Assumption was burned after the priest was caught hiding a Jewish family in the rectory. In Vézelay, the cathedral became a barracks, its pews torn out, its altar covered with Wehrmacht supply crates. But the Cathedral of Saint-Michel remained untouched, not because the Germans were merciful, because they were strategic. The cathedral was monumental, its spire visible from every approach to the town. It was centrally located, dominating the main square where civilians gathered for rations and announcements, and it was architecturally significant enough to photograph well. German command understood that letting the cathedral stand sent a more powerful message than burning it ever could. They framed it as respect for French tradition and religious heritage. Official communiqué praised the occupiers' restraint. But the truth was simpler. God was allowed to remain, on German terms. Other clergy in the region weren't so fortunate. Father Dubois in Saint-Rémy was arrested for refusing to ring the church bells during a German parade. Father Mercier in Vézelay vanished after delivering a sermon about Pontius Pilate. By late 1940, half the priests in the diocese had been removed, relocated, or disappeared entirely. Father Virot remained, not because he was trusted, because he was useful. When German officers attended Mass, and they did, early on to establish the symbolism, Father Viro completed the service without deviation. He did not insert coded messages into his homilies. He did not refuse communion to men in uniform. He did not protest when a captain lit a cigarette inside the sanctuary. He simply continued. The Germans interpreted his silence as submission, his compliance as proof that even the church had accepted the new order. They photographed him at the altar, hands raised in benediction, light streaming through stained glass, the image of peaceful occupation. What they didn't see was the calculation behind his restraint. Within 6 months, the cathedral had become something else entirely. Civilians still attended Mass, but now they did so under observation. German soldiers stood at the rear of the nave, watching, counting, taking note of who prayed too fervently, who wept during hymns, who whispered to their neighbors. Faith became performance. Worship became surveillance. And Father Anselm Viro, the quiet priest the Germans had dismissed as harmless, began to understand exactly what they had done. They hadn't just occupied his town. They had weaponized his cathedral. They had turned the Mass itself into a tool of control. And in doing so, they had made a miscalculation that wouldn't become clear for 3 more years. They had left him access to the sacrament. The first child Father Viro buried under occupation was a boy named Thomas Leclerc. He was 9 years old. He had been shot in the town square as a reprisal for a burnt German supply truck. A truck Thomas had never seen. In a resistance action he knew nothing about. The Germans chose him because he was standing, nearest to the square when the order came down. 1 child, 1 bullet, 1 message. Father Viro conducted the funeral without bells. The Germans had forbidden them. By the winter of 1941, he had buried 11 more children. By the summer of 1942, he had stopped counting. The graves multiplied in the cemetery behind the cathedral. Small plots with wooden crosses, many without names because identifying the dead had become dangerous for the living. Families attended funerals in silence, forbidden to weep too loudly, forbidden to protest, forbidden to ask why. Father Viro delivered the same liturgy each time. Suffer the little ones to come unto me. The words felt heavier with each repetition, hollow, as if God himself had stopped listening. But the most unbearable moments didn't happen at gravesides. They happened in the confessional. German officers began using confession not as a sacrament, but as a conversation. They would enter the booth, kneel out of habit, rather than humility, and speak, not of sins, of operations. A captain once confessed that he had processed 43 deportations that month and expected 50 more by Christmas. He spoke the numbers the way another man might mention the weather. An officer named Kruger mentioned a village called Evreux, said it would be cleared within the week. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply stated it, as if informing God of an administrative detail. Father Viro sat on the other side of the lattice screen, hands folded, silent. He began to remember everything. Names, villages, dates, casualty estimates, spoken like grocery lists. The confessional became a ledger of future atrocities, crimes not yet committed, but already planned, already inevitable. And he was the only record that existed outside German files. What could he do with this knowledge? Report it to whom? The resistance networks in the region were fragmented, hunted, unreliable. The British were too far. The Americans hadn't yet landed. And even if he could get word out, would it arrive in time? Would anyone believe a priest? So he continued to sit in the confessional. He continued to hear. He continued to bury. And slowly, something inside him eroded. His prayers changed. He no longer asked God for miracles. He no longer prayed for liberation or justice or even mercy. He prayed only for endurance, the strength to make it through one more Mass, one more confession, one more funeral for a child whose name he didn't know. But by late 1943, Father Anselm Virot had begun to understand something the Germans hadn't intended him to see. They weren't just occupying his town. They were using God as camouflage. The cathedral wasn't a symbol of faith. It was a propaganda tool. The Mass wasn't worship. It was theater. And his own restraint, his silence, his obedience, it had all become complicit in their machinery. He had spent 3 years protecting the cathedral by not resisting. And in doing so, he had allowed it to become a monument to their control. The question he could no longer avoid was simple and terrible. What good is a church that only survives because it serves evil? The order came on a Thursday afternoon in early December 1943. A German adjutant arrived at the cathedral rectory with a typed memorandum on official stationery. Father Virot read it twice to make sure he understood. A ceremonial Mass. Sunday morning. 15 high-ranking commanders rotating off the Eastern Front. Full dress uniform. Front row reserved. No civilian attendance permitted. The adjutant waited while Father Virot read, as if expecting questions. There were none. The priest simply nodded. The adjutant saluted and left. Father Virot stood in the empty rectory, memorandum still in hand, and understood immediately what this was. It wasn't worship. It was documentation. The Wehrmacht had become obsessed with records in the final years of the war. Photographs, reports, ceremonial events that could be filed and referenced. A Mass attended by 15 commanders in a French cathedral would make an excellent image. Proof of order, proof of normalcy, proof that even occupied, France recognized German authority as divinely sanctioned. The photographs would appear in newsletters. The event would be noted in official logs. Some bureaucrat in Berlin would file it under cultural relations or religious affairs. But Father Virot learned the real purpose 2 days later. On Saturday evening, an officer named Obersturmbannführer Dietrich arrived for confession. He entered the booth and began speaking before Father Virot could offer the traditional greeting. Dietrich didn't confess. He briefed. The Mass, he explained, would precede a major operation, a pacification sweep of the surrounding region. 8 villages, targeted for suspected resistance activity. The operation had a timeline. Begin Monday morning, complete by Wednesday evening. Expected casualties were estimated at 400 to 600 civilians, depending on cooperation levels. Deportations would follow for any survivors deemed useful for labor. The rest would be handled locally. Dietrich listed the village names as if reading a supply manifest. Montbrun, Crécy, Saulieu, Valmond, Roche-en-Berny, Trévoux, Maison Blanche, Saint-Laurence. The Mass tomorrow, Dietrich continued, is important for morale. The men need to know God is with them before difficult work. Father Virot sat motionless behind the screen. His hands, folded in his lap, had gone numb. This was different. For 3 years, he had buried the dead. He had heard confessions about operations already completed, atrocities already committed. He had absorbed the violence as a witness, powerless but present. He had told himself that bearing witness was a form of resistance, that remembering the names, the faces, the crimes mattered, even if he could do nothing to stop them. But this was not testimony about the past. This was a blueprint for the future. The commanders would kneel in his cathedral Sunday morning. They would receive communion. They would be photographed, blessed, documented, and then they would leave and kill hundreds of people whose only crime was living in villages whose names Father Viro now knew. The Mass wasn't incidental to the operation. It was the final seal, the liturgical approval, the moment when violence would be wrapped in sanctity and sent out with God's implicit endorsement. Dietrich finished speaking and left the confessional without waiting for absolution. Father Viro remained in the booth long after the officer's footsteps faded. He understood now what he hadn't allowed himself to see before. The cathedral hadn't survived because the Germans respected it. It had survived because they needed it. And Sunday morning, it would be used to bless a massacre. The final instruction arrived Sunday morning at dawn, delivered by the same adjutant who had brought the original memorandum. Father Viro answered the rectory door still in his nightclothes, and the adjutant handed him a second sheet of paper. The commanders required the Eucharist to be prepared in the traditional manner. No substitutions, no modern alterations, the full Latin rite, wine and unleavened bread consecrated according to established church doctrine. The reason, the memorandum explained, was to avoid any rumors or irregularities that might diminish the ceremony's significance. The adjutant waited for acknowledgement. Father Viro nodded. The adjutant left. The priest stood in the doorway as gray light spread across the empty square. The paper trembled slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from the recognition of what had just happened. For 8 months his access to the sacrament had been restricted. The Germans had required him to prepare communion in their presence, with their oversight, using materials they provided. It was a humiliation disguised as protocol, a reminder that even the Mass occurred only by their permission. But now, for this ceremonial event, this performance meant to legitimize slaughter. They needed authenticity. They needed the ritual done correctly, traditionally, without German fingerprints visible in the process. They needed it to look holy. So they had restored his authority, complete preparation rites, full access to the sacristy, the chalice, the wine, the host, everything he needed to perform the Mass exactly as it had been performed for centuries. They had given him back the one thing they should never have returned. Father Viro walked slowly back through the rectory into the sacristy. He stood before the altar, hands resting on the cold stone. The cathedral was silent except for the faint creak of wind against the ancient windows. He did not weep. He did not pray for guidance. He did not make dramatic vows or clench his fists or rage against God for putting him in this position. He simply understood. This was the moment history would never record. The instant when a decision became inevitable not because it was right, but because every other option had been foreclosed. The villages would burn unless the commanders did not leave this cathedral. 400 to 600 lives hung in a balance that only he could tip. There was no resistance network to contact, no time to get word to Allied forces, no way to warn the villages or evacuate them before Monday morning. There was only this: 15 men who would kneel before him in 4 hours, expecting communion, expecting blessing, expecting to walk out and begin killing. Father Viro opened the cabinet where the sacramental wine was stored. He retrieved the chalice, the paten, the linens. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of 2 decades of service. He did not plan an escape. He did not consider what would happen to him after. He did not think about survival or consequences, or whether his soul could withstand what he was about to do. He planned only correctness, precision, completion. The Mass would be performed exactly as prescribed. Every word spoken in proper order. Every gesture executed with reverence. The commanders would receive communion in the traditional manner, and they would suspect nothing. because nothing would appear irregular. Father Anselm Virot prepared the sacrament alone in the sacristy, and the only sound was his own breathing. By the time the bells rang for Mass, everything was ready. The cathedral was colder than it had been all winter. Father Virot stood at the altar, the 15 commanders arranged in perfect formation before him. Their uniforms were immaculate, black wool pressed sharp, hot medals aligned in precise rows, boots polished to mirrors. They knelt in unison, hands clasped, faces forward, not in humility, in expectation. Behind them the nave stretched empty. No civilians, no witnesses. Only the stone arches rising into shadow and the stained glass filtering winter light into fragments of red and gold. Father Virot had reached the moment the entire Mass had been building toward, the liturgy of the Eucharist. He lifted the chalice first, speaking the words of consecration in Latin, his voice steady and clear. Hic est enim calix sanguinis mei. This is the chalice of my blood. He set it down gently, the base connecting with the altar cloth without sound. Then he took the host between his thumb and forefinger. He raised it slowly above his head. Sunlight caught its edge, illuminating the thin wafer against the dark stone behind him. The light seemed to hold there, suspended, as if the cathedral itself had drawn breath. His hands did not shake. There was no tremor in his fingers, no hesitation in the gesture. His face remained calm, distant even, as if he were completing the 10,000th Mass of his life, rather than the last. To anyone watching, he was simply a priest performing the ritual exactly as it had always been performed. But Father Anselm Virot knew what no one else in that cathedral could see. This was not doubt. This was not fear. This was faith, sharpened to a single irreversible point. For 3 years, he had prayed for deliverance and received only silence. He had asked God to intervene, to send angels or armies or miracles, and none had come. He had buried children and heard confessions that were catalogues of atrocity, and watched his cathedral become a stage for evil. And now, in this moment, hands raised, host elevated, light breaking across stone. He understood that deliverance had never been something that would arrive from outside. It had always been a choice he would have to make himself. He spoke the final words of the consecration. Mysterium fidei, the mystery of faith. The phrase had never carried such weight. Because this was the mystery, wasn't it? That faith could lead a man to this exact place. That devotion and resistance could become indistinguishable. That the holiest act in Christianity could also be the deadliest. Father Virot lowered the host and placed it on the paten. There was no turning back now. History would not thank him for this. The villages he saved would never know his name. The church would not canonize him. God himself might not forgive him. This act would be buried in classified files, misattributed, erased from every record that mattered. But the 8 villages, Montbrun, Crécy, Saulieu, Valmont, Roche-en-Berny, Trévoux, Maison Blanche, Saint-Laurent, would still exist Monday morning. 400 to 600 people would wake up alive, because 15 men would not. Father Virot turned toward the kneeling commanders and spoke the words of invitation. Behold the Lamb of God. Behold him who takes away the sins of the world. The first commander rose and approached the altar rail. The Mass continued, and nothing at all, appeared out of place. The first commander to receive communion was Obersturmbannführer Dietrich, the man who had listed the village names 2 days earlier as if reading a supply manifest. He rose from his kneeling position with military precision, approached the altar rail, and tilted his head back slightly. Father Viro placed the host on his tongue. Dietrich closed his mouth, returned to his position, and knelt again. The second commander approached, then the third. One by one, they came forward. Boots scraped against stone with rhythmic exactness, the rustle of wool uniforms, moving in formation, the faint clink of metals shifting against breast pockets. Each man received the sacrament with the same posture, the same expression, not reverence but entitlement. They had been promised communion, and communion was being delivered. Father Viro's face remained serene, his hands steady. His voice never wavered as he spoke the words, Corpus Christi, the body of Christ. 15 times he spoke those words. 15 times he placed the host on waiting tongues. 15 times the ritual was completed without deviation, without suspicion, without a single commander questioning what they had just received. The trust was absolute. Not trust in Father Viro. They had never trusted him. Trust in the ritual itself. The ceremony was too old, too established, too embedded in centuries of tradition, to be anything other than what it appeared to be. When the last commander returned to his position, Father Viro turned back to the altar and completed the concluding prayers. His Latin was flawless, his gestures precise. He raised his hands in final blessing. Dominus vobiscum, the Lord be with you. The commanders did not respond. They simply stood when the liturgy ended, adjusting their uniforms, preparing to leave. There were no bells. The Germans had forbidden them years ago. There was no applause. This had been a ceremony, not a performance. Father Viro descended from the altar and walked toward the sacristy without looking back. Behind him, the 15 commanders filed toward the cathedral's main doors in formation. 2 columns, perfect spacing, boots echoing in the empty nave. The photographer captured them as they exited. 15 men in black uniforms, emerging into December sunlight. It would be the last photograph ever taken of them alive. The first signs appeared 11 minutes later. Oberst Manfred Fischer, third in command, stumbled on the cathedral steps. His adjutant caught him, assuming he had lost his footing. But Fischer's face had gone pale, his breathing shallow and rapid. He tried to speak and couldn't form words. By the time they reached the commandeered hotel 2 blocks away, 3 more commanders were showing symptoms. Severe abdominal pain, vomiting, disorientation. Within 20 minutes, it was clear this wasn't food poisoning or coincidence. Someone shouted for the doors to be sealed. Guards rushed to block the exits. Medical personnel were summoned, but there were no doctors in Aumont qualified to treat what was happening. No one knew what they were treating. The collapse spread like wildfire through a dry forest. Commanders who had been standing moments earlier were now doubled over, convulsing, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Subordinates tried to help and didn't know how. The hotel descended into chaos, shouting desperate orders, the sound of bodies hitting floors. By 4 o'clock, 9 were dead. By sunset, all 15 had stopped breathing. The cathedral bells remained silent. Father Anselm Viro was already gone. By the time German soldiers stormed the cathedral at 5:30, the sun had already begun to set. They entered with weapons drawn, shouting commands into empty air. Boots thundered through the nave, scattering across the transepts, converging on the sacristy. An officer kicked open the door so hard it cracked against the interior wall. The room was empty. Father Viro's vestments lay folded on the preparation table, the chasuble, the stole, the alb, arranged with the same precision he had used for 22 years. The chalice had been cleaned and returned to its cabinet. The altar linens were stored in their proper drawer. Everything was in its place, as if he had simply finished Mass and stepped out for a moment. Except he hadn't stepped out. He had disappeared. The soldiers tore through the rectory. They searched the bell tower, the crypt, the storage rooms beneath the choir loft. They interrogated the two nuns who maintained the chapel adjacent to the cathedral. Both claimed they hadn't seen Father Virot since morning Mass. They questioned neighbors, checked the roads leading out of town, dispatched patrols to surrounding villages. No witnesses, no sightings, no body. Father Anselm Virot had simply ceased to exist. In the sacristy fireplace, still warm to the touch, they found the remnants of burned documents, parish records, correspondence, personal journals. Everything reduced to ash and charred paper fragments, too damaged to reconstruct. Whatever Father Virot had kept written down, he had made sure would not survive him. By Monday morning, the German response had crystallized into something remarkably efficient. Silence. The incident was classified immediately. Orders came down from regional command within hours. This was not an attack. This was not sabotage. This was medical contamination. A tragic case of food poisoning, likely from spoiled provisions at the hotel kitchen. The fact that all 15 men had attended Mass together was coincidental. The timing was unfortunate. These things happened during war. Official reports made no mention of communion, no mention of the cathedral, no mention of a priest. The story fed to subordinates was consistent and unambiguous. Contaminated meat from a supply shipment. The hotel staff were arrested as scapegoats. The investigation was declared closed within 72 hours. Anyone who suggested otherwise was reminded that speculation undermined morale and would be treated as defeatism. The Mass itself was erased from all documentation. The photographs taken that morning, the ones meant to prove divine order and cultural harmony, were destroyed. The ceremonial event that was supposed to bless the pacification sweep simply never happened, according to every remaining German record. And the operation, cancelled. Without commanders, without leadership, without the blessing they had demanded, the 8 villages were left untouched. Monday came and went. The Wehrmacht units assigned to the sweep were redirected elsewhere. Montbrun woke up. Crécy prepared breakfast. Children in Saulieu walked to school. 400 to 600 people continued living, unaware they had been scheduled to die. The Cathedral of Saint-Michel remained standing. The Germans didn't burn it. They didn't close it. They didn't even station permanent guards inside. It simply stood there, doors unlocked, nave empty, altar undisturbed. Another priest was eventually assigned, a younger man from Lille who asked no questions and kept services brief. But something had changed in the cathedral that no one could quite name. The light through the stained glass seemed colder. The acoustics felt different. Civilians who returned for Mass after the incident reported feeling unsettled, though they couldn't explain why. The building was structurally identical, the liturgy unchanged, and yet the space felt hollow, as if something essential had been removed that could never be replaced. Villages woke up on Monday morning, December 13, 1943, and continued living. In Montbrun, a baker named Henri Colbert opened his shop at dawn, as he had every morning for 30 years. In Crécy, children walked to the schoolhouse that still stood at the edge of town. In Saulieu, a woman named Marguerite Dulac hung laundry on a line strung between 2 trees, her hands red from the cold. None of them knew. They had no idea that their names had been spoken aloud in a cathedral 2 days earlier. That casualty estimates had been calculated, that deportation schedules had been drafted, that 15 German commanders had intended to arrive by noon Monday and begin what they called pacification. The operation simply never came. No trucks appeared on the roads. No soldiers surrounded the villages. No orders were given. The Wehrmacht units assigned to the sweep were redirected to other fronts. The paperwork was filed under postponed indefinitely and eventually lost in the chaos of Germany's WWII, collapsing eastern defenses. By the time the war ended in 1945, the 8 villages had survived occupation relatively intact. Their survival was attributed to luck, to shifting German priorities, to the fog of war. No one connected it to a mass that no longer existed in any official record. No one knew to thank a priest whose name never appeared in any history. There were no monuments erected, no plaques installed outside the Cathedral of Saint-Michel, no ceremonies honoring Father Anselm Viro, because officially nothing had happened. The 15 commanders died of food poisoning. The priest resigned his position and relocated. That was the story, and it remained the story for decades. In 1983, a historian researching resistance activities in occupied France discovered a photograph in a private collection, a blurred image, poorly preserved, dated December 1943. It showed the interior of a cathedral. A priest stood at the altar, arms raised, holding something small that caught the light. Below him, arranged in rows, were men in dark uniforms, kneeling. There was no caption, no identification of location, no names recorded. The photograph had been separated from whatever documentation originally accompanied it. The historian filed it under unverified location unknown and moved on. The image survived in an archive in Lyon, rarely viewed, never explained. Father Anselm Viro exists nowhere else. His name does not appear in parish records after December 1943. No death certificate was ever filed. No grave bears his name. Church archives contain a single-line notation: Father A. Viro, assigned 1921, departed 1943, circumstances unknown. He became a gap in the records, a silence between lines, a question mark in the margins of history. This story offers no comfort. It does not claim that what Father Viro did was righteous. It does not ask you to forgive him or absolve him or call him a hero. It simply presents the truth as it unfolded in a cathedral in December 1943, when a man of God faced an impossible choice and made the only decision he believed could stop what was coming. When evil cloaks itself in ritual, resistance may look indistinguishable from sacrilege. Father Anselm Viro did not shout. He did not deliver defiant sermons. He did not organize uprisings or sabotage supply lines. He did not raise a weapon or throw a grenade or fire a single shot. He completed the Mass. He performed the Eucharist exactly as it had been performed for centuries, with precision, with reverence, with hands that did not shake. And in doing so, he ended 15 futures so that hundreds of others could still exist. The villages of Montbrun, Crécy, Saulieu, Valmont, Roche-en-Berny, Trévoux, Maison Blanche, and Saint-Laurence remain standing today. Their streets still carry the names they carried in 1943. Children still play in their squares. Life continued. Because one man understood that sometimes salvation requires damnation, and that the holiest act can also be the last line of resistance. The story of Father Anselm Viro reveals a crucial truth often overlooked in World War II history. The most effective acts of resistance weren't always the most visible ones. History celebrates armed partisans and battlefield soldiers, but some of the most devastating blows against the Nazi war machine came from people who were never supposed to be threats: nuns, priests, clerks, who falsified documents, train operators who accidentally delayed deportations, ordinary people who made extraordinary choices when they found themselves holding a single moment of power. Father Viro's story also shows how the Nazis weaponized symbolism. They understood that controlling a population meant controlling meaning itself. By allowing churches to function under their supervision, they sent a message. Even your sacred spaces belong to us now. But symbolism cuts both ways. The same ritual the Germans trusted became the mechanism of their destruction. They never suspected the communion because they had reduced it to theater. They forgot it was still a sacrament in the hands of a man who believed in it. What we know is this: 8 villages survived, and 15 men who planned their destruction did not. If this story left you questioning what you would have done in Father Viro's position, if you believe these buried acts of resistance deserve to be remembered even when they make us uncomfortable, if you want to see more stories that history tried to erase, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications, because we're not here to tell you sanitized versions of World War II. We're here to show you the stories that were too complicated, too morally ambiguous, too dangerous to fit into textbooks. The stories about ordinary people who became something else when they were forced to choose between complicity and damnation. Every subscription tells. YouTube to show these stories to more people. Every like pushes back against 80 years of silence. Subscribe now, because Father Viro's name was erased once. Don't let it be erased again. And if you think this story was intense, wait until you see what's coming next. Click the video on your screen right now for an even more thrilling story of resistance, betrayal, and impossible choices during the darkest chapter of human history. Trust me, you won't want to miss this one. Click it now, and I'll see you there.